I found out I was locked out the way people always find out they've been publicly labeled, in front of other people. 1 second I was typing my code like I'd done 100 times, and the next I was staring at a stubborn red light while the gate stayed shut. My phone buzzed with a message from the HOA that used the same 2 words over and over, final notice, like repeating it made the humiliation official. In that moment, the question wasn't even about swimming. It was about what I do when the HOA decides I'm guilty, locks me out, and expects embarrassment to do the rest of the work. I didn't bang on the gate. I didn't argue with anyone. I just stepped aside, let a family pass through behind me, and felt my face go hot as the latch clicked for them but not for me. I walked back to my car like I'd forgotten something, and only when I was alone did I look at the message again. It claimed I'd violated amenity rules repeatedly. It said my access was revoked, effective immediately. And it ended with that neat little phrase that sounded like a door slamming. Final notice. The background matters, because I wasn't some loud resident who treated the pool like a party zone. I was the quiet, predictable kind. I worked long hours, and the pool was the one place I could reset without staring at a screen. A few laps. 10 minutes floating. A routine that made the neighborhood feel like home. Our community itself looked like the kind of place that sells peace. Trim sidewalks, matching mailboxes, the little landscaped entrance sign that always got photographed by realtors. The HOA loved rules because rules made things uniform, and uniform made people feel safe. But there's a difference between maintaining a neighborhood and policing it, and our HOA had drifted into policing a while ago. It started with small signs, literally. New laminated sheets appeared on the pool fence every few weeks. Reminders about towels, reminders about guests, reminders about quiet hours. Each one sounded reasonable until you noticed the tone. It wasn't helpful. It was accusatory, like the HOA assumed everyone was about to misbehave and needed to be corrected preemptively. The real shift happened when a new community compliance coordinator began sending emails. Not a board member, not quite management, but someone who spoke with the confidence of authority. The messages were always cheery on the surface and sharp underneath. They thanked residents for cooperation, but every paragraph hinted at consequences. Around the same time, one neighbor started popping up everywhere. At the pool gate, near the mailbox cluster, hovering by the dog walk path like a security camera with a haircut. I'll call her Jay. Jay wasn't loud in the obvious way. She didn't scream. She didn't throw tantrums. Her power came from her certainty. She pointed at signs. She watched. She asked questions that weren't really questions. She carried herself like she was doing the neighborhood a favor by catching people in tiny mistakes. The first time she focused on me, it was almost laughable. I'd walked out of the pool area with my towel folded, and she stepped closer than a stranger should and gestured toward the posted rules, like I'd missed something. I remember nodding politely and continuing on, because I didn't want conflict. The next day, an email arrived from the HOA about resident pool conduct. No name. No detail. Just a reminder that residents must follow rules to keep amenities safe and enjoyable. I shrugged it off. That was my first mistake, assuming vague reminders were harmless. A week later I received a formal notice. It wasn't mailed. It was a PDF attachment with my address at the top and the HOA's logo in the corner. It claimed there was a documented violation related to guest policy. The problem was, I hadn't brought a guest that day. That's when I started keeping what I privately called my sanity file. I printed the notice, dated it with a pen, and put it in a folder. I took screenshots of the pool rules posted on the community portal. Then, because I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the start of something, I pulled up the governing documents and found the section about amenity enforcement. The CCR language was dry, but one line stood out. Privileges could be suspended, but the homeowner must be provided notice and an opportunity to be heard. Notice and an opportunity to be heard. Not, maybe. Not, if the HOA feels like it. The process. I emailed back, calm and polite, asking for specifics. What day? Time? What was the alleged behavior? What evidence supported it? And what was the hearing procedure, if this was going to escalate? The reply was a masterclass in saying nothing. It thanked me for my cooperation and reminded me to review posted rules. That's when my quiet routine started to feel like I was being watched. I'd walk to the pool, and Jay would be there, not swimming, not lounging, just positioned where she could see who entered. I would take my laps and keep to myself, and somehow, a new reminder would appear in my inbox the next day. It was always vague, always about general conduct, always implying a pattern. The conflict rose from annoying to targeted the day the HOA sent a second notice claiming I'd left a mess. I hadn't. I always tossed my empty bottle in the bin and folded my chair towel. But the notice didn't care about facts. It was framed like a warning. It included phrases like repeated concerns and continued non-compliance. It also hinted that further violations could lead to amenity consequences. That's when my stomach sank, because I could see the latter. Vague accusation. Vague warning. Then punishment. I responded again, asking for evidence. I asked whether there were photos, whether there was a log, whether the HOA had a standardized violation report. Instead of answering, they escalated. A third message arrived a few days later. It referenced final notice for amenity conduct and said the next step would be immediate suspension of pool access. Still no specific facts. Still no hearing rules. The word final notice is supposed to come at the end of a process. Here, it was coming at the beginning. That's when I realized the humiliation wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Because the pool gate is public. The denial is visible. If you get locked out, everyone sees. People don't ask what happened, they assume you deserve it. And if you're the type of person who hates attention, you'll do anything to make it stop, even if you didn't do anything wrong. The HOA was counting on that. So I shifted from being confused to being methodical. I started logging every interaction. Emails saved as PDFs, notices printed, screenshots of the portal, photos of the signage at the pool gate, even the calendar of when I used the pool, because I wanted a record of my routine if they claimed I was doing something unusual. Evidence prop number 1 was that dated notice with the vague accusation. Evidence prop number 2 was the CCR section about hearings and amenity suspensions, highlighted and printed. Evidence prop number 3 was a screenshot of the pool rules as posted online, because I didn't trust them not to quietly change language later to justify what they were doing now. At this point, I was still hoping there was some simple explanation, a mistaken identity, a sloppy complaint process, an overzealous staffer. I tried giving them every off-ramp. I asked for a hearing. I asked for specifics. I asked for the enforcement policy in writing. They gave me nothing. Then came the day that flipped everything into a true HOA nightmare. I drove home from work and decided to swim before dinner. The sun was low, the air warm, the kind of evening that makes you forget you live under an association's rulebook. I walked up to the gate, typed my code, and got the red light. I tried once more, slower, like maybe I'd hit the wrong button. Red light again. Behind me, a couple approached with pool toys and towels. They waited politely. I stepped aside, forcing my face to look neutral. They typed their code and walked right in. I wasn't just denied. I was displayed. I backed away from the gate and opened my phone. That's when the HOA message popped up, as if timed for maximum impact. It stated my pool privileges were revoked after final notice and that any attempt to access amenities would be considered a violation. That last line was the trap. If I tried again, I'd be attempting access. If I asked questions, I was escalating. If I protested publicly, I was disruptive. The HOA had built a little box and expected me to shrink inside it. I didn't. I quietly recorded the keypad rejecting my code, showing the red light and the gate staying shut. Then I walked away without making a scene. In my kitchen, I laid everything out on the counter like I was preparing for an audit. Notices, screenshots, the CCR excerpt, my timeline. And then I wrote an email that did 3 things. First, it acknowledged the revocation in neutral language. Second, it requested the hearing rules, specifically the procedure, the timeline, and who makes the decision. Third, it requested the evidence they claimed justified the action. I ended it with a simple sentence: I want this resolved through the process the governing documents require. Within an hour, they replied, and the tone was icy. It said my conduct had created concern, that the revocation was administrative, and that hearings were handled at the board's discretion. That was a problem, because the CCRs didn't describe hearings as optional favors. They described them as part of enforcement. So I asked again, more pointedly but still calm, please provide the written hearing procedure and the authority basis for immediate suspension. Their next move was to widen the humiliation. The HOA sent a community-wide bulletin the next day. Most of it was normal, pool hours, reminders about trash bins, landscaping notes. But buried in the middle was a paragraph about amenity misuse and privileges being suspended for repeat violators. No names, but it felt like a spotlight, a subtle signal to the neighborhood, someone is being punished, and you should assume it's justified. That same afternoon, I walked past the pool on my way to get the mail and noticed a new laminated sheet taped inside the gate, facing inward. It wasn't visible from outside unless you stood at an angle. It warned residents not to challenge staff decisions and to report suspicious behavior near amenity access points. I photographed it from outside, carefully, and saved the image with the timestamp. The sensory detail that stuck with me wasn't even the words. It was the way the paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, like a tiny flag planted to claim territory. That's when my anger finally sharpened into something useful. Because this wasn't just about the pool. It was about creating a narrative where I was the problem, and they were the protectors. And the more I tried to solve it quietly, the more they pushed the shame outward so the neighborhood would do the punishing for them. Here's the turning point. I realized I didn't need to argue with their narrative. I needed to force them into the light. So I drafted a targeted records request. Not a rant. Not a threat. A structured request for documents. The violation log tied to my address, the complaint summaries that led to enforcement, the communications about revoking my access, and any agenda excerpts or meeting notes where my amenity privileges were discussed. That's the thing HOAs hate most. Not confrontation, but paperwork that creates a trail. Because once there's a trail, vague accusations become vulnerable. Before I sent it, I did one more check. I opened the community portal and took fresh screenshots of the amenity rules as currently posted. I compared them to the screenshots I'd taken weeks earlier. And that's when I noticed something subtle. The language around administrative suspension looked slightly different. Not hugely, but enough that it could be used to justify what happened to me. It was as if someone had quietly updated the page to support their decision. I wasn't sure I could prove it yet, but I had my earlier screenshots, and the formatting differences were obvious enough to raise questions. At this point, a rational person might have backed off just to avoid the stress. But the HOA had made it social. They had made it humiliating. They had made it feel like I was being watched. And that meant backing off wouldn't end it. It would invite the next step. So I sent the records request. The moment I hit send, my stomach flipped. Not fear, anticipation. Because I knew what was coming next. Either they would produce records that exposed their own weak process, or they would retaliate. 2 hours later, another email arrived. It wasn't about the pool anymore. It said my amenity privileges were now fully suspended, and it included language suggesting additional restrictions could be applied if I continued to challenge enforcement. They were trying to punish me for asking for transparency. And then, as if to make sure the whole neighborhood understood, I got a notification that a new community announcement had been posted, one that referenced resident misconduct and security concerns. I stared at my phone, feeling that cold, tight pressure behind my ribs. They weren't just locking me out. They were building a file. They were building a story. And I had a sinking feeling that the next step would involve more than a gate code, because once an HOA decides you're a problem, they don't stop at the pool. Module 1 complete. Module 2 starts next. The next day, the retaliation moved from emails into real-world friction in a way that felt calculated. I went to the gym instead of the pool, trying to keep my routine stable. When I returned, I found a fresh notice taped to my door. It looked official, but it wasn't delivered the way official notices usually were. It was just the paper was crisp, the font a little too bold, and it referenced continued violations without describing any. I didn't touch it right away. I took a photo first, showing it on my door with the date visible on my phone screen. Then I peeled it off and added it to the folder. Evidence prop number 4. A physical notice that appeared without a clear delivery record. That same afternoon, I got another message from the HOA claiming I had been approaching the pool gate in a manner that raised concern. Apparently, walking past an amenity I used to enjoy was now suspicious. They were trying to paint me as a threat to justify the punishment. And in a neighborhood like ours, that kind of implication is gasoline. People don't need proof, they need a story. The HOA had gifted them one. I could feel it in the tiny social shifts. A neighbor who used to wave looked down at their phone. Someone who used to chat by the mailboxes suddenly had somewhere else to be. Even the casual friendliness of the place felt strained, like people were afraid being seen talking to me would connect them to whatever narrative the HOA was spreading. That's how humiliation works. It isolates you without a single explicit accusation. But I wasn't going to let isolation become evidence. So I went quiet in the way that matters. I stopped reacting emotionally and started forcing procedural pressure. I replied to the HOA with a single question. Please confirm, in writing, the hearing rules for amenity suspension referenced in the governing documents, and provide the records requested regarding the decision to revoke my access. No extra commentary. No anger. The silence after that message lasted 2 days. And those 2 days told me the truth. They didn't have a clean process. If they did, they would have sent it immediately. The delay meant they were either scrambling to create one or hoping I'd get tired and go away. Then came the move that pushed this from petty to dangerous for them. I received an agenda packet for the upcoming board meeting through the community portal. Most residents never looked at these. I did. And there it was, an item buried under New Business that referenced amenity enforcement policy updates. Not my name, not directly, but close enough. The timing aligned too neatly with my records request. They weren't just retaliating. They were trying to legitimize what they'd already done by adjusting policy after the fact. That's when my plan clicked into place. If they wanted to use the board meeting to retroactively sanitize the punishment, I needed to be in that room. Not to argue, but to ask questions that could only be answered with records. I submitted a request to speak during the homeowner forum. Short and neutral. I said I wanted clarification on amenity suspension procedure and access revocations. I also prepared a binder. Not a dramatic binder. A clean one with tabs, notice timeline, portal screenshots, CCR excerpt, emails, signage photos, community bulletin, door notice. And in the front, a single page summarizing what I wanted, the hearing rules and the records behind the action taken against me. The night of the meeting, the community room smelled like stale coffee and dry carpet, and the fluorescent lighting made everyone look slightly irritated even if they weren't. Board members sat behind a folding table, wearing expressions that said they wanted this to be quick. I sat in the second row. Not front and center, not hiding. Visible. When the homeowner forum started, I stood, introduced myself, and stated my request. I wanted the board to clarify the process for revoking amenity access and confirm the hearing procedure required by the governing documents. The manager, same one who'd been sending emails, responded with a familiar set of vague phrases: administrative action, safety concerns, repeated violations. They used the same foggy language because fog is useful. Fog keeps people from asking for specifics. So I did the one thing fog can't handle. I asked for specifics. I referenced the CCR section about hearings and asked whether a hearing had been offered before my access was revoked after final notice. I asked what evidence supported the violations claimed. I asked whether a board vote had authorized the revocation. Those questions weren't dramatic. They were procedural. But they landed like a stone in a quiet room. Board members looked at each other. The manager's posture tightened. Someone in the audience shifted and leaned forward. The board president tried to smooth it over by saying they trusted management and that details were confidential. Confidential. Another convenient word. I stayed calm and clarified that I wasn't requesting public disclosure of private information. I was requesting the board confirm whether the documented process, notice and an opportunity to be heard, was being followed. That's when the room started to wake up. Because suddenly, it wasn't about me being locked out of the pool. It was about whether the HOA could revoke any resident's access based on vague accusations and then call it administrative. People who didn't care about my pool access cared about that. A resident asked what would happen if someone made a false complaint. Another asked how they would defend themselves. Someone else asked whether the HOA had written hearing rules at all. The board members tried to answer without answering, but the pressure was different now. It wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the idea that the HOA could quietly punish anyone. That's when I opened my binder, not to slam it down, not to make a show, just to reference documents like someone discussing a contract. I mentioned the dated notice I'd received that lacked specifics. I referenced the screenshots showing the portal rules as they existed before my access revocation. I referenced the photo of the new laminated sign inside the gate, posted after the revocation, warning residents not to challenge enforcement. Evidence props in sequence, spaced and calm, like stepping stones across their narrative. The manager attempted to frame my documentation as harassment of staff, which was almost comical, because the only thing I'd done was ask for procedure and records. The board president asked the manager if a hearing had been offered. That question hit like a crack in glass. The manager said something about a meeting option, the kind of private meeting they could later deny. The board president asked again, specifically about a hearing procedure. Silence. In that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Because now it was clear to everyone what I had suspected. They had escalated punishment after final notice without a real hearing process in place. The board couldn't ignore that without admitting they were approving arbitrary enforcement. And that's where the satisfying part of this revenge story finally became inevitable, not because I won, but because I forced the HOA into a corner made of their own documents. The board president announced they would pause any expansion of amenity restrictions until they reviewed the enforcement process and confirmed hearing procedures. They directed management to provide hearing guidelines in writing and to respond to records requests in a timely manner. Then, and this was the part that made my pulse finally slow, the board stated that my pool access would be temporarily restored pending that review. Not because they suddenly cared about my swim routine. Because they needed to stop the bleeding. The next week, I received a formal packet from the HOA that included what I'd been requesting for weeks: the hearing rules, the appeal steps, and a clearer outline of how amenity suspensions were supposed to work. The language was polished, which told me it had been drafted in a hurry. But it existed now, and it existed because I'd forced it into existence. Even more important, they responded to my records request. Not everything. Some pages were clearly summarized instead of fully detailed, but there was enough to expose the core issue. The violations were mostly complaints, recorded without specifics, treated as proof without verification. That was the heart of it. Vague accusations turned into administrative punishment. Once that pattern became visible, the HOA had to change how it operated, at least on paper. And something else happened too, something quieter, but just as satisfying. The community bulletin about misconduct disappeared from the portal. Not replaced, not corrected, just quietly removed. The laminated sign inside the pool gate was taken down. A generic reminder about pool etiquette replaced it, stripped of its targeted tone. The HOA was trying to rewind the humiliation now that it had backfired. When I went to the pool again, my code worked. Green light. The gate opened like nothing had ever happened. The air smelled the same, chlorine and sun-warmed concrete, but my relationship to the place had changed. I didn't feel like a guest anymore. I felt like someone who understood how easily a system could be used against a homeowner, and how powerful a paper trail could be when it's calm and consistent. Jay was there that day, sitting under an umbrella, watching the gate like she always did. Our eyes didn't meet. She looked away first. The retaliation machine couldn't run as smoothly anymore, because now there were questions. Now there were hearing rules. Now there were residents who understood that administrative punishment could happen to them too. And that's the real aftermath of this kind of homeowners association drama. It's not about one person's access. It's about whether the rules are a shield for the community or a weapon for the loudest complainer. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, The agenda included an official item about standardizing enforcement documentation. They were adding requirements for complaint details, dates, and verification steps before severe actions like amenity revocation could be taken. I didn't need to speak at that meeting. The system had already shifted. The best part was that I didn't have to become loud to do it. I didn't have to escalate with emotion. I didn't have to play their shame game. I just held up their own process and asked them to follow it. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA versus homeowner situation, you know how rare it is to win without losing yourself in the stress. Right when you think it's just a pool gate and a code, it becomes a story about control, reputation, and whether a neighborhood can quietly turn on someone because a complaint sounded confident. If you want more stories like this, hit like, share this with someone who's survived an HOA nightmare, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment your own HOA experience below. Thanks for watching. Next time, I'll tell you about the inspection window that was supposed to be routine until the HOA tried to turn it into a trap for my entire property, and I discovered a small change in their documents that they never meant anyone to notice.